Welcome to Mooney Reads, and welcome to a Pride Month wrap-up. I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in June. These were for the Queer Lit Readathon, which ran all month this round, which I love that they're starting to do for Pride Month. So I started off the month with Restart After Growing Hungry, which is the sequel to Restart After Coming Home, which I read at the end of last month. So I basically went from one into the other. It's a pretty cute series. It's slice of life, nothing like really spicy or anything like that. So, there I think was more miscommunication than I would have liked. Given everything else in the story, it didn't necessarily bother me in the way that it does bother me in other stories. I can really tell you why. It might have just been the vibes. It did try to tackle certain emotional things for both characters, and I thought that was pretty cool. It was the first thing that I read this month, so to be honest, I don't remember it super well, but I remember parts of it being really cute, and it being pretty alright. It fit for the Queer Lit Readathon prompts: graphic, international, and continued. After that, I read Breathe. This was written by Sarah Peitzmeier and Maia Kobabe, who did Genderqueer. I really enjoyed this. I think I enjoyed it more as a researcher than as someone looking for binding information. Although there is both. So this is a graphic nonfiction that is partly about qualitative researcher that Dr. Peitzmeier did, looking at people who bind. Partly that and partly binding information. I think the part that I liked most was the first section where people were talking about their experiences with binding. I really loved getting to hear their experiences, and I loved that they had such a wide variety of people. And I think the thing that made me so jazzed about this book was the fact that this was qualitative social science research that is put into such a digestible and accessible form. Like, I want to do that with my thesis. Like, that would be so cool. Like, the idea of that is just really neat to me. And I love that somebody did that. It feels like it makes so much more of an impact than just writing something up and submitting it to an academic journal that's got a paywall and everything else. So far as the tips and information about binding, there were parts of it that talked a lot about the science of it and like what's actually been researched, which is cool. So I like that there was that focus. There were also some cool worksheets and things included that are to basically make you think about your relationship with binding and how you're feeling about it, both emotionally and physically, to make sure that it's safe. I will say that if you're looking for something about like how to start binding or where to find a binder, this is not really what this book is for. It doesn't list places to get them. It does mention types of binders, but doesn't really talk about the logistics of like what is better, like a zipper one versus one that you pull over. It doesn't really go into that. It does talk about the fact that some methods are unsafe, so things like binding with ace bandages is not safe, and talks about things like taking breaks. I think it could have gone into some stuff a little bit more in that regard, but I do like a lot of what was there, and I was super jazzed to see someone take research like that and put it in such an accessible and digestible form. This fit for the Queer Lit Readathon prompts for graphic and mental health. Next, I read the novel Bohemia by Sarah Schulman. This is a multi-perspective novel that focuses on a group of friends in New York during the early 90s. All of the characters are queer, and one of them is HIV positive. And the whole vibe points of the book is looking at New York during the height of the AIDS epidemic. Now, this was actually published in the early 90s, mid-90s, 1995. So this would have been written and put out kind of during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when there wasn't a whole lot of resources, a whole lot of really hope. I think this would have been around the time when the only real treatment was AZT. At least that's likely when this was written. All of the characters in here are very chaotic and very, while they're a friend group, they're also all very distanced from each other in a particular way. And despite the fact that they're all, not really talking in these particular ways and sharing these similarities, they still all end up facing similar things. So I think there's this sort of contradictory feeling of having a shared experience but not really acknowledging it and being isolated within it. I think that a lot of the weird vibes of this make sense with some of the other literature that I've been reading that were published by queer authors during the height of the AIDS epidemic. I really liked this. It was bleak, but it was written in an interesting way and was quite clever, I think. This is my first fiction that I've read by Sarah Schulman. I've read some of her nonfiction, but I will definitely be also reading more of her novels. And this fit for the build your own prompt for a queer lit readathon, and I put it up there as a backlist book. After that, I read Don't Be a Drag by Skye Quinlan, and this was a young adult novel, and I bought it purely only knowing that it was a romance between two drag kings. I wasn't even sure if it was YA or adult or what, knew nothing else about it. But I picked it up and I'm glad I did. It's pretty cute. Definitely firmly YA. This story starts out, our main character, Briar, has gone to visit her brother in New York. Her brother is a drag queen, and they're from Texas. Neither of them are really thriving in Texas. But she goes up and ends up meeting his new friends on the drag scene, ends up maybe talking a little shit in response to somebody acting like a little shit, and winds up in this drag competition. So she's learning more about drag and becoming a drag king and meeting these new characters who really become her friends. And as much as I picked this up because of the romance aspect, I ended up liking the friendship aspect a lot more. This also deals a lot with mental health. Briar has really severe depression, anxiety, and is dealing with suicidal ideation. And I think this book handles that really well. There's also an autistic character in here. Achilles, I almost said Apollo, wrong god. Achilles, who ends up becoming like her best friend. I think the one major thing that I didn't love is that I think that the tension between the main character and the love interest was sort of forced. Like, I think that certain things were blown up in a way that wasn't maybe necessary, but honestly, that wasn't that huge of a deal to me. There are things that I could critique, but I didn't really want to. And this has a charm that certain YA books have that I love, and I think that that's kind of what people mean when they say that a book like reads more YA. But I kind of like that sometimes, and I really liked it in this book. It was really cute, and I would recommend it if you're in the market for queer YA. It makes me so happy that this exists. And it's just one on the, many books that I've read over the past like 5 years or so that I wish I had had as a kid. But I'm glad that it's in the world now. This fit for the Queer Lit Readathon prompts night. A lot of this takes place at night. because it's set like in a sort of nightclub setting, and mental health. Oh, another thing that I thought about this, speaking of night and that component, another thing that I liked about this was that they were able to be in this setting without it being weird. Like, they weren't drinking even though they were minors. They weren't sleeping with people who were too old, which I have encountered both of those in a different YA book that was focused on drag that made me kind of sad. Not that it's not realistic, because some kids do that, but some kids don't do that. I also really liked the discussion of drag that was going on in this. There was a lot of emphasis on the diversity of drag, both in terms of who can be a drag king or a drag queen, and some of the things that are sort of explored. They talk about cosplay, they talk about incorporating like gender bent stuff. I feel like there might have been people who were playing on like animals in their drag. I could be making that up though, because I've been looking at other things about drag. But I do know that they were talking about the more expansive nature of drag, which I also really liked. After that, I read Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This was a lesbian noir with angels and demons. It was short, it was engaging, it had twists and turns, and some elements I expected, but it never came in the way that I was expecting it. There was always something extra, something interesting and unexpected. It was super atmospheric. I felt like I was in 1940s Chicago. That being said, it also portrayed queerness in a realistic way, or the queer experience, I think, in a realistic way, both in talking about how one would have to act in public, especially as a queer couple, and it also dabbles at a certain point in the issue of institutionalization. It doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time on that, but it is mentioned, so I thought that it was realistic in those ways. Immaculate vibes. Definitely recommend. And this fit for the prompts magic and night for a queerlit readathon. Magic because there is magic. The main character is a magical person, and it's urban fantasy. So there are like magical elements incorporated with the real world. And then night because a lot of stuff in the book happens at night. After that, I read what I think is going to be my favorite graphic novel of the year. And that is The Deep Dark by Molly Knox Ostertag. At the beginning of this month, I did not know that she even had a new book coming out. And so shame on the internet for not streamlining that directly into my brain. Because I absolutely love The Witch Boy. I really liked The Girl from the Sea as well. So I knew I had to get this. And it was chunky. And from what I had read, it was going to be darker. So I was all about it. And it exceeded my expectations. This focuses on Mags, who is in high school and also taking care of her grandmother, who's dealt with a number of strokes and different things like that, while also harboring a secret. During the story, her childhood best friend returns back to town, and keeping her secret a secret becomes exponentially harder. I won't give any more details to the plot than that, because I went in not really totally knowing what direction it was going to go in, and I'm glad. This was just amazing in so many different ways. I loved the characterization, both in terms of writing and art. I loved some of the turns that it took, and some of the ways that it talked about mental health, as well as some of the stuff that was like, I guess, like secondary to the main plot. For instance, and since it kind of starts out with this, I'll speak on it a little bit more. At the beginning of this, Mags is seeing a girl who is dating a guy, like cheating. And throughout the course of the book, that's kind of talked about a little bit more, and isn't just left as like a detail as though that was like a normal thing. That character kind of goes through some things. Another example of this, the friend who comes back to visit is trans, and the way that that is shown throughout this is also really great. And I'm having a hard time talking about this because there's so many things that I like and ideas that I have about this that I'm afraid to kind of start saying because I don't want to spoil anything. But this book is amazing, and if you like queer graphic novels at all, you absolutely have to read this. This went for the prompts: mental health, graphic, obviously, night, because night is significant in the story, and then outdoors, because quite a lot of this does take place outdoors, but also the cover is outdoors, so I think that would make it count too. After that, I read Wear, Repair, Repurpose, A Maker's Guide to Mending and Upcycling Clothes. And this is what the title says. This is kind of why you should wear, repair, repurpose. So it shows you how to mend certain things on clothes, and this is your kind of simple standard fixing tears, putting on buttons, but also repairing things in a way that's a little bit more obvious. So fix your stuff and make it fashion, and also use some of the other clothes that you have laying around so that the scraps don't go into landfill. It includes also a discussion of sashiko, which is another more visible form of mending that is Japanese, that looks pretty but is also like useful. Doing all of these things also makes the clothes more durable. It's got stuff on darning, which is fixing holes in knitted items, and also ideas for how to repurpose things. So stuff like turning your no longer necessary t-shirts into yarn and making stuff out of it. It has a lot of really cute ideas. I already crochet and know how to latch hook, and some of the stuff is kind of around that, so that's cool. It also talks a little bit about piecing together things like quilting, but also things that are maybe a little lower grade than literally quilting. But yeah, it gave me a lot of ideas. I did a number of the things in here. Like it, I think that the illustrations in this were super helpful. You can really see how it's going to go in, I think, better than some other ones that I've seen. And I've been wanting to mend stuff and get more into the sewing parts for a while, but I just haven't. And reading this gave me the initiative to, and I actually followed the instructions that they laid out. I don't have any of the things that I like fixed necessarily like normally in front of me, and plus they would be boring to look at because it's just like a button. But I'm also trying out the sashiko, and this is a pair of pants that busted at the thigh because of course they did their pair of pants. But I'm just kind of playing with it, and I am going to try out more of the things. This pair of pants is just going to be my a trial run on embroidery, basically. I've got so many things saved on Pinterest too, but I'd also like to try the other things in here. One of the things that I thought was cool about this book is that it talks about the different ways that you can do things regardless of your kind of skill level and the things that you have access to. The bulk of it does focus on hand sewing, which I think is the most like middle ground, but it also mentions things that you can do if you are more of an iron-on sort of person and you don't really sew. And it also mentions things that you can do if you have a sewing machine. So, it was pretty cool. I haven't read a whole lot of other stuff about sewing So I don't know how it measures up to those other things, but I had a good time with it, and it got me sewing. So it's good in that way. And I did not realize until I had finished reading the book that the author is queer. I was scrolling through her Instagram and saw some Pride graphics that she did, and some of the stuff that she does is for other people, but in the caption, it was clear that she's part of the queer community. So that's super cool. Then the final book that I read this month was The Z Word by Lindsay King Miller. This was a queer slasher featuring zombies, lots of chaotic queers, and criticism of rainbow capitalism. So what's not to love? This was delightful, weird. I had a great time with it. Some of it was a little bit campy, obviously, but it was also really intense. I was super invested in the interpersonal dynamics, but also the actual action that was going on, or like not even just the action scenes, but the tension around the actual situation that's happening with the sort of zombies also really had me. And I can't say really too much about it because it would give things away, but I also think that the way that they went about the commentary was super cool. I have thoughts on it. I really want to talk about some of that, especially because I'm of two minds about some of it, some of the things at the end, but I can't really talk about that without being spoilery. But overall, I really liked it. If you're looking for some fun horror, definitely pick up the Z Word. And this I used to cover the Creepy Queers prompt in the Queer Lit Readathon. So that's all that I finished for the month, but I do have 4 that I started. I started the audiobook of Who is Wellness For, which I'm really enjoying. I just didn't, I guess, listen enough of audiobook to finish a whole audiobook this month, which is fine. I'm still working through it. This is part memoir and part critique of wellness culture, especially looking at things like cultural appropriation, and also the Western idea of like the mind-body split. So a lot's going on in this book, and I'm really enjoying it. I also started We Both Laughed in Pleasure, the Selected Diaries of Lou Sullivan, which I'm doing as sort of a buddy read with my partner. I haven't gotten super far into this, but I, for one thing, really enjoyed the introductions, especially the one that Susan Stryker did, hearing about how his story kind of impacted her, especially since like she was one of the people that made these diary entries like accessible for the editor to even be able to put this together. So that's just very cool, and I love the sort of connection that she talks about. Another book that I started reading was Decolonized Drag. I've gotten about a third of the way into it, and I'm really liking it so far. This is talking about looking at drag more expansively, looking at where it is in a variety of cultures, and also kind of different things that could be kind of like talked about in drag. And this also critiques mainstream representations of it. I'm sure a lot more of that is going to come in later, especially looking at things like RuPaul's Drag Race. So I thought that this was going to be really interesting to read with, like, don't call it a drag. We kind of saw some discussions looking a little bit more expansively than the mainstream, but this is going to dig way deeper than that one would. And it's also interesting to read this while starting to watch Canada's Drag Race, because I'm already seeing, I think, representations of drag that are more expansive than on the American Drag Race, especially looking at the early seasons. But anyways, this is going to be cool, and I'm excited to get more into it. And actually, the Queerlit Readathon, one of their Read Queer All Year prompts for July is to read a book about drag. So this is going to be perfect for that. Maybe I'll pick up more books on drag too, because I was kind of hoping to do a sort of mini deep dive into drag this past month, but it just didn't happen. Maybe it'll happen in July. The final book that I read part of during June was Let the Record Show by Sarah Schulman. And this is a book that I've talked about reading so many times. It's honestly a little embarrassing. But she's chunky. I picked her up because I've been needing to read it, generally speaking. But Tome Topple started on the 21st. So my thoughts were maybe I could finish it for the Queerlit Readathon. Maybe I could finish it just for Tome Topple. And neither of those things happen. It's the third. I'm not going to finish half of the book. But I've started it. I'm going to continue it. And I'm going to keep reading until I'm done. Even if this is the only book that I read in July. It's going to happen. And I made a good dent in it. So I had read the first 130 pages the last time I read it. And I went through and I read all of the things that I had tabbed and highlighted, plus a little bit more for context. That was not a fast thing to do. It wasn't the same as like rereading it, but a look at how often I have tabbed it. I was looking at least half of the pages. So I did that, and then just continued reading and continued tabbing and highlighting and all that. But this is just amazing. For those of you who don't know, Let the Record Show is a political history of ACT UP New York that's based on interviews and oral histories from members in ACT UP, compiled by a member of ACT UP at the time, Sarah Schulman. One of the really big focuses of this is to look at the complexity within the history of ACT UP. I think most mainstream narratives of ACT UP, including things like How to Survive a Plague, and like TV representations of it and things like that. It's very white, middle class centered. And those were not the only people in ACT UP, and that was not the only thing happening in ACT UP. And this goes through and looks at things a lot more complexly, because there was a lot happening. This was I can't think of the word, but this was not a top-down organization. There were lots of different caucuses of people, little groups of people who could put together their own thing, bring it to the floor, and have more people in the group join them. That's kind of what made ACT UP unique. So you had a lot of different ideas, a lot of different people. The folks within ACT UP, their idea of who ACT UP was or who made up ACT UP were going to be very different, because it was such a large, very expansive group with a lot of different ideas. So this is looking at the history of ACT UP in a larger sort of way, and is also going to be, it looks at the history during this time, which includes their split, which happened in the 90s. And it's already talked about that some, kind of in the course of this so far. And it's really interesting reading this, especially after having read Moving Politics by Deborah Gould, which was more focused on the emotion of ACT UP. Specifically, there's obviously a lot of overlap in things, but this just illuminates certain things even more. It's just a very interesting read. There's just so much in this book, and I'll probably need to do a standalone video for it when I finish eventually. those are the things that I read in June. Let me know about your reading during Pride months in the comments. And thank you all so much for watching.